Well, now they know. Let it.
He told me you killed him. No, I am your.
Sleigh bells in the snow, the snow, then I.
Hey, Doc, we better back up. We don't have enough road to get up to 88.
Roads? Where we're going, we don't need.
My mom always said life was like a box.
To infinity and.
It's time for the announcement. Okay, people, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., Santa's coming to town.
Hey, I'm so glad you chose to join us today as we celebrate the birth of Jesus and prepare in this season. So let's jump right in. I am not sure if you're a Google Maps person, if you're an Apple Maps person, or if you're a no map at all type of person. That would be my wife. But the reality is that especially when you're driving through a new area, having a GPS can be really helpful. And while that's true, and while I love a good GPS, I often find myself kind of debating with the information that pops up on the screen, either because I think I can beat the traffic and make it there sooner, or because I don't trust what it's telling me to do, right? I don't trust the route that it's suggesting. Sometimes I'm driving and then a new suggested route pops up and it just interrupts the plans I already have, right? Certain places I already know how to get there and I don't really trust what it's telling me to do. To be fair though, there have been times when I did precisely what Google told me to do, only to get stuck in traffic for a long time. And there have also been times when I happily chose to ignore the directions and actually made it to the destination much faster. You know, the truth is that as helpful as these devices can be, whichever one you choose to use, they're not perfect, you know. But what if we did have an infallible GPS, not for traffic interruptions, but for life decisions? You know, today I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the ways that God uses interruptions to give his route for our lives. That's what we're going to call interrupting guidance. It's God's infallible way to give us direction. But before we go in, I want to remind you of a key truth that we've been talking about, and you may want to write it down. It's that God does his most significant work when he interrupts our most definitive plans. You know, it's usually when we're pretty set on something, God comes and kind of interrupts that he's doing some of his most beautiful works. And sometimes these interruptions can feel pretty annoying. You know, it interrupts our expectations, but whenever we see them as a blessing instead of an interruption, they kind of lose their annoyance. You know, we move from being annoyed to being expectant because we trust what God is trying to do. That's what we're going to see in Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 18. And while you're finding that, I just want to recap a little bit what we talked about last week. You know, we saw that God had led the Magi to come to Bethlehem to bring their gifts to Jesus. But in order to find him, they had to pass through Jerusalem, which was the capital city. That's where they met King Herod, who was crazy, right? Herod wanted them to tell him where the baby boy was, and whenever they found him. But they were actually warned by an angel not to go back to Jerusalem and not to tell Herod. So Herod never actually heard back from the Magi. And this is kind of the scenario when we get to Matthew 2, verse 13. It says, "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.' Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. So think about this scenario here. This whole story is pretty tragic, right? Herod realized that he had been tricked by the wise men. They had been warned not to go back to him. And then his fury here was on full display. His way to give retribution was to kill all the little boys who were 2 and under in Bethlehem. And because of the size of that village, that would have been maybe 10 to 20 children, but you can imagine what that did to those families, you know? And it's interesting, though, that Jesus was not one of those boys. You know, he lived, and we see that he lived because God interrupted Joseph's plans with guidance. That was interrupting guidance for Joseph. Now, here's what I want you to understand about the story. You know, at this point, Mary and Joseph are not living in a stable with farm animals. They have a home. They have decided to settle, to stay in Bethlehem. They probably have called that place home for a little bit now. You know, they probably thought that that's where Jesus needed to be raised, and that's when God interrupts them with a dream. Again, God is giving them guidance, showing them exactly where to go. And if you remember back in chapter 1, we talked about that, you know, Joseph was thinking about being quiet and ending his engagement with Mary, right? When an angel came to him and told him, hey, the baby that she has in her womb is actually from the Spirit. So go ahead, don't fear, take her as your wife. And Joseph immediately goes, after he wakes up, goes to Mary, takes her as his wife. He obeys immediately and completely. And we see the same thing in this situation here. You know, I don't know if I had ever noticed what was happening, but in verse 14, it talks about his obedience being also pretty immediate. You know, he rose and took the child and Mary by night to Egypt, and most commentators here think that this was the same night when he received the dream. So he packs up his whole life into a little cart and starts this maybe 80-mile journey on foot with a young family to a country that he'd likely never visited before. And that's what we call complete and immediate obedience. Now the question is for us, would we do the same thing? You know, in all honesty, if you were Joseph, would you pack up and leave in the middle of the night without even waiting for the light of day? Would you obey completely and immediately the way that he did? I don't know if I would do that. You know, and maybe if you saw an angelic message as an interruption to your plans or goals for life, you probably wouldn't. It would be too inconvenient. Why is this angel telling me to do this? It doesn't make sense. But if you believe that this wasn't an interruption, but it was actually divine guidance, I'm pretty sure you would probably take the risk. You know, I think you would do the same thing as Joseph did. It all comes down to our perspective on the instructions. And let me tell you something about God. I want you to write this down. This is really important. When God tells you to do something, is just as important as what he tells you to do. So when he tells us something, is just as important as what he tells us to do. Timing is everything to God. This is why delayed obedience isn't just disobedience, it's actually dangerous. And that's what Joseph is experiencing here. When the angel says, hey, rise and take the child, that's exactly what he does. You know, here in the Greek, the word for is about to, when it comes to Herod, carries the idea of something that could happen at any second, right? And so any delay on Joseph's part could have cost his son's life. And so I believe that Joseph wasn't willing to risk that, you know, regardless of how inconvenient it might have been for them. But the reality is it is no different for us when it comes to the interruptions that God gives us. You know, as long as we view them as interruptions, we will always drag our feet. But when we view them as instructions instead of interruptions, we will take action, you know? And we can think of it this way. You may be on a road trip, and then all of a sudden something comes up on your GPS, and you have the option to kind of take a different route because of traffic that's ahead of you. You know, and you have an option here, a choice to make. And I think your answer depends on your level of GPS trauma, because too many of us have followed the map and ended up in some weird places, so we kind of hesitate when it comes to that. But what if you knew that the voice was infallible? What if you knew that the voice could not be wrong? I think my guess is that we would take the exit immediately and follow what the GPS was telling us to do. And if I can share something with you, the instructions of God are in fact infallible. I'm not saying that our minds or ears are infallible. We make mistakes. We're not as wise as we would like, but God knows exactly what He's telling us to do. He never fails. And I believe this is what Paul is getting at when he talks about walking in step with the Spirit in Galatians 5. It's this posture of listening for God's instructions and moving and stopping as He tells us to. And I want us to finish up the passage going through verses 19 through 23 to see what happens here. It says, "But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, 'Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead.' And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene." So pay attention to all the details in the story. It's just so rich in terms of everything that God was doing to make this story come to pass. Again and again, God interrupts Joseph's sleep with a guiding message, and again, Joseph actually obeys, not only completely, but immediately. And I want us to notice a few things about the story. First, I want us to notice that no matter how hard the devil tries to get victory over Jesus, in his early years, as long as Joseph is obeying God's guidance, the plans of the enemy just keep backfiring in his face. Let's just make it clear. It is the devil trying to take Jesus down. It's not Herod, it's not anyone else, but as long as we are obeying, not only completely, but immediately, the devil will never win. That's also true for our lives. And listen to what the book of Revelation says about what is taking place in the heavens. The woman in this passage that we're going to read is referring to Mary, and the ancient dragon is referring to the devil. So we're going to read Revelation verses 4 and 5, and then 13 and 14. Revelation 12 verse 4 starts saying, "His tail swept down a third of the stars in heaven and cast them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to His throne." So pay attention now to verses 13 and 14. "And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time." The book of Revelation has a lot of symbolic language, but what we see here is that the devil is trying to devour Jesus, and his plans keep failing. The flight to the wilderness is most likely referring to the flight to Egypt, and his plan failed there too. When Herod couldn't do it, Satan tried to use his son Archelaus, but again, God led Joseph to Nazareth, and the devil's plans failed again. And get this, not only did his plans fail, but they actually helped Jesus in fulfilling all the prophecies mentioned about him. He came from Egypt because the devil's plans drove him there. He was called a Nazarene because the devil's plans forced him to go there. Everything that the enemy intends for harm, God turns around and He uses it for good. And that is true for my life and for your life. And church, that's why we follow God's plan. He knows what He's doing. He knows what's best for us. That's why we follow Him immediately. He knows exactly what we should do. But that leads me to a final thought here. You know, from this story, you can see that God has a much higher view of circumstances than we do. Joseph was only looking at things from a moment by moment level. And, you know, for Joseph, it was like, go to Bethlehem, go to Egypt, go to Nazareth. He was just following instructions. But God can see the whole plan at all times. You know, he's not just giving step-by-step instructions blindly. He's standing above the whole universe, seeing all of it and how it fits together. And I don't know if you've been to a maze, you know, or gone to a pumpkin patch, but usually when you have a maze, people get lost when they go in. But they also tend to have these elevated platforms right next to it. You know, you can stand there and give directions because you can see everything that's going on. Now, the person that's below, you know, is completely blind. And if they trust the one giving the commands, they know exactly what they need to do. And that's what happens in our relationship with God. You know, right now, if we'll take time to listen, God has given us instructions. And they may sound like interruptions, but they are His guiding, you know, and direction for our lives. And we need to remember that He has good intentions for us, that He knows exactly what He's doing. You know, He will be the one saying, hey, go left, go forward, go right, do this, stop here. But the question is, are we listening? You know, and are we really listening to the things that He has to say? I firmly believe that God is speaking, you know, but that doesn't mean that we're listening to what He's saying. Sometimes He's speaking in soft thoughts as we are praying, seeking His presence. Sometimes He's speaking, you know, in sermons from inadequate preachers like me. Sometimes He's speaking through circumstances or closed doors or unexpected illnesses or losses. All of the things in our lives that feel like interruptions. But He's still speaking. You know, the question is, are you listening? What is He telling you to do? And the second question that I want to bring up to your attention is, do you trust Him? You know, in this maze called life, do you trust His voice to guide you every step of the way? If not, let me remind you that He has already proven His love for us by being willing to come to earth, take on flesh, die on the cross for our sins. You know, He has already proven Himself to be trustworthy in every way. But do we trust Him? You know, I believe that even now, Jesus is calling some of you to action. He's calling some of you to trust Him. He's calling some of you to believe that He's worthy of your trust and obedience. You know, but what will your posture be this morning? You know, I believe He's calling some of you to place your faith in Him for the first time. You know, He's telling you right now, and you feel it, and you're trying to fight it, but you know that He's trying to get your attention. You know, I believe that He has moved your entire life through His providence in ways that are so perfect that we cannot understand to bring you to this place, to hear this message, and to find salvation in Him. But that can only happen if you choose to humble yourself before Him. So I want to encourage you, just as Joseph was being obedient, you know, going whenever God told him to go, staying whenever God told him to stay, I want to encourage you to have that same posture today. Will you trust His voice and obey what He's telling you to do? You know, please do not let this moment go by without responding, without placing your faith in Him. He is worthy of our trust. And so just as we've seen in Joseph's life, in the way that God orchestrated everything perfectly to get him to that moment, to save Jesus' life, to allow Jesus to grow up and go to the cross and do the things that had been foretold for Him to do, God has a plan for us. You know, it's only a matter of whether or not we'll choose to join Him and obey Him. So please do that this morning. God bless you.